everyone. Nice to meet you all. So I am a soil scientist from Columbia University, and today I'm going to talk about the science of composting. So first, let's understand what is composting. According to USDA, the definition says that composting is the process of recycling organic materials, such as leftovers, into something that can be helpful for our environment, specifically for soil and plants. And if you look at the EPA definition, you can see that it's a little bit more detailed. It says that this process is managed, and specifically, this is an aerobic process, meaning that oxygen is required. We need oxygen because microbes need oxygen. So basically what happens is that there's microorganisms that are breaking down the leftovers over there, and then that can turn into something that would be beneficial for soil and plants. And then we also need to understand what we can use for composting. And I have divided typical materials into 3 bins here. So the first 2 bins are helpful for composting. So first we need to have carbon-rich materials such as dry leaves, wood chips, paper bags, shredded paper, and also tree twigs. And we also need to have nitrogen-rich materials such as coffee and tea residues, grass clippings, vegetable and fruit leftovers, as well as eggshells, because microbes need to utilize both of those materials. So we need to keep a good balance among those materials. And we also need to avoid some specific materials, such as fish, meat, oil, dairy products, which can introduce pests and pathogens. And we also need to avoid pesticides or pest-infested vegetations because they can contaminate your leftovers. And then we also need to understand the 3 major phases of composting. So the first phase here being the mesophilic phase, meaning that the temperature is moderate. In Fahrenheit, it's about 50 to 100. And in this process, microbes are mostly working on materials such as sugars and also starches. And then in the second phase, because of the intensive microbial activities, there's a lot of heat, the temperature goes up to about 160 Fahrenheit. And then the microbes are working on something that are a little bit more difficult, such as cellulose, fat, and also proteins. And in the end, we're going back to the mesophilic phase again. And in this process, which is slower and longer, the microbes are mostly working on resistant organic matter and then turn them into something called humus. And in this whole process, we need carbon as energy, we need nitrogen as protein, we need oxygen, as well as adequate water, pH, and also nutrients. And because carbon dioxide is being released throughout this whole process, usually there is a decrease of carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the carbon to nitrogen ratio for the final product is very important to compost because that would influence something called soil health. And as a soil scientist, I want to briefly mention that at the end of the talk as well. And then also let's look at the comparison between composting and just sending your leftovers to landfill. So if you were to look at the top left corner of this slide, you can see that what happens with landfill is that we're going to sending our leftovers, and then there's some type of machinery that goes in and compact this whole leftover. So in this case, there isn't a lot of oxygen, and that is opposite to what happens with composting, where we have a lot of oxygen. When there isn't a lot of oxygen, usually what happens is that there could be a lot of acidic leachate that can contaminate the environment. At the same time, that can introduce a lot of greenhouse gases. So if we were to look at the 3 major greenhouse gases here in the table, and if we were to combine them together using carbon dioxide equivalents, then you can see the total is about 25 times higher for landfill compared to composting. It's about 15 times higher if we were to consider emission factor, which are scaled by dry matters. And the figure on the right also shows you the comparison. So basically with landfills, we're worried about pollution, climate change, health hazards, but with composting, which can handle more than 50% of the leftovers, it is a much more sustainable and safer way. And finally, very quickly to make the connection between composting and soil health. So if we were to consider compost, it is usually one of the organic fertilizers that can provide plant available nutrients, but at the same time, it can also provide something called organic matter that can feed soil microbes. And that is very important for improved soil health, improve water holding capacity, and also try to improve our environmental qualities through all different ways, like improving soil structure. On the other hand, if we were to just stick with only synthetic fertilizers, that can have some nutrients for the plants, but doesn't do much for improving soil health. So in the long term, that can degrade soil health and also cause environmental risks. So that's about composting. Thank you very much.